Somewhere in Wisconsin right now, an apple orchard is in full bloom. The trees are covered in white blossoms. A farmer spent all winter planning for this spring. And tonight, temperatures are going to crash to 23 degrees Fahrenheit. In Pennsylvania, strawberry fields that took years to establish are about to get hit by sub-freezing air that has not touched this region in May for years. In Ohio, tomato seedlings that home gardeners planted just days ago, believing winter was over, are going to be killed stone dead by morning. Frost advisories and freeze warnings are in effect across 18 states right now, from Texas all the way to New York. The National Weather Service is calling this one of the most widespread May frost events in recent memory. And the worst of it has not even arrived yet. This is Weather Signal, and you need to know what is coming. To understand why frost warnings are plastered across the map from Texas to New York in the second week of May, you have to understand what has been happening in the upper atmosphere over North America since the beginning of this year. It starts with the polar vortex. According to AccuWeather lead long-range expert Paul Pastelok, a shift in the polar vortex earlier this spring created what he called an atmospheric traffic jam, a disruption that has allowed repeated waves of cold air to slide southward out of Canada into the Midwest and Northeast with unusual frequency and persistence throughout April and now into May. The polar vortex, as Wikipedia describes it, is a large area of low pressure and cold air surrounding the Earth's North Pole, with strong counterclockwise winds that normally keep Arctic air locked in the far north. When that vortex is disrupted or displaced, it sends lobes of frigid Arctic air spilling southward into populated agriculturally active regions, exactly what has been happening all spring. Newsweek confirmed that millions of Americans from Texas to New York are under frost advisories and freeze warnings as a massive cold front sweeps across the United States, bringing a sharp and unseasonable drop in temperatures. The National Weather Service issued cold weather alerts across the southern plains, Midwest, Northeast, and Mid-Atlantic, with nighttime lows expected to plunge below freezing in some areas. The specific states carrying those alerts are staggering in their geographic reach: Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. 18 states. That is nearly half the continental United States sitting under frost advisories or freeze warnings simultaneously. In May, during peak planting season, the coldest weather will hit western and southern Wisconsin, where temperatures as low as 23 degrees were expected overnight, according to the NWS office in La Crosse. 23 degrees in mid-May. That is not a marginal frost. That is a deep, hard, killing freeze, the kind of temperature that damages pipes, destroys established perennial plants, and wipes out entire crop fields in a single night. The NWS State College, Pennsylvania office stated plainly, frost and freeze conditions could kill crops, other sensitive vegetation, and possibly damage unprotected outdoor plumbing, adding that valley locations and sheltered rural areas will experience the coldest temperatures. Most people assume that once April ends, the threat of frost is essentially over for most of the country. That assumption is wrong in a normal year, and it is dangerously wrong in 2026. AccuWeather senior meteorologist Alex Sosnowski explained that a shift in the polar vortex earlier this spring is helping to set the stage for repeated, chilly stretches across the central and eastern United States in the weeks ahead, with below-average days likely to outnumber warmer ones. Households, schools, and businesses in the Midwest and Northeast may need to run heat on some days in the weeks ahead, when many typically switch to air conditioning and shut down furnaces for the summer. AccuWeather's Paul Pastelok told Newsweek the polar vortex disruption created an atmospheric traffic jam that allowed waves of cold air to move south from Canada into the Midwest and Northeast. He added that below-average departures during the first 10 days of May will be significant, especially in the Ohio Valley, Great Lakes, and interior Northeast. The mechanism works like this. When the polar vortex is disrupted, meaning its normally tight circular flow around the North Pole becomes elongated, wavy, or fragmented, pieces of the vortex detach and drop southward. Each fragment carries a dome of genuinely Arctic air. In spring, these fragments interact with the increasingly energetic jet stream to produce sharp, fast-moving cold fronts that drive temperatures well below seasonal averages across large geographic areas. This spring, the disruption has been persistent enough that multiple cold air outbreaks have struck the Midwest and Northeast in succession. AccuWeather senior long-range meteorologist Chad Merrill placed this season in a specific historical context, stating that May of 2008, 2020, and 2021 look similar to the temperature forecast for May 2026 from the Midwest to the Northeast, and that those years were cold. Those are not random reference years. May 2020 saw temperatures in parts of the Midwest fall into the upper 20s during the second week of the month. May 2021 brought frost to New England well past the typical last frost date. May 2008 was one of the coldest Mays on record for parts of the Great Lakes. The fact that AccuWeather's long-range modeling is drawing direct comparisons to those years tells you that this is not a brief, cold snap that ends in a day or two. Severe weather. Europe's spring 2026 forecast confirmed that a lingering polar vortex core over Canada is still having a measurable impact on the upper Midwest and northeastern United States, keeping temperatures persistently below normal. Even as the main polar vortex weakens through spring, the residual cold anomaly in the atmosphere keeps producing these damaging frost events weeks after they would typically be expected to end. Here's the dimension of this frost event that most weather coverage is not adequately addressing. The timing of this freeze, mid-May, right in the heart of the agricultural growing season, is creating genuine economic devastation across American farming regions. And the damage is being amplified by something that happened earlier this spring, an unusually warm March that pushed plant development weeks ahead of its normal schedule. AccuWeather's Sosnowski explained this dynamic in stark terms. Some warm days were extreme enough to force bud break, trigger blossoming, and cause leaf out weeks ahead of average. This early growth set the stage for damage as bouts of cold air brought frosts and freezes, which are not unusual for April. As budding, blossoming, and leaf out expand northward in May, and with frost and freeze episodes likely to continue in the Midwest and Northeast, the risk of additional damage remains. Some agricultural interests will need to protect orchards, vineyards, and berry patches. When plants break dormancy and begin actively growing, they lose the cold hardening that protects them during winter. The cells within buds, blossoms, and new leaves become filled with water as they grow. When those cells freeze, ice crystals that form rupture the cell walls. The damage is permanent and irreversible. A flower killed by frost does not recover. A fruit that never forms, because the bloom was killed, means an entire season of lost production for that farmer. The RFD TV Crop Progress update from May 4th confirmed the growing crisis. The USDA's weather bulletin highlighted sharp cold in the Northeast, with freeze concerns for fruit crops. In New England, frost and freeze conditions during the week raised concern for orchards, berries, and other specialty crops already pushed by earlier warmth. In the broader mid-Atlantic, specialty producers were watching for damage assessments as May began, with frost risk on blooming fruit crops after earlier warmth accelerated development. USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey, speaking at the NAFB Washington Watch event, specifically flagged that late April and early May forecasts indicate a risk of late-season frost in the mid-Atlantic and eastern Corn Belt, potentially threatening emerging summer crops and specialty fruits. And now the situation has escalated further, with tonight's deep freeze pushing into territory that threatens even established cold-tolerant crops. The cumulative picture that emerges from all of these sources is not of a single damaging frost event. It is of a season-long cold pattern that has been systematically damaging the agricultural output of the central and eastern United States, with each new frost event adding to losses that were already accumulating from April's repeated freeze episodes. And the economic consequences of that cumulative damage are going to ripple through food supply chains in ways that consumers will eventually feel at the grocery store. Most people understand that frost kills plants, but very few people understand the specific mechanisms by which frost causes damage, and understanding those mechanisms is crucial for knowing which plants are most at risk, what temperatures represent genuine danger, and what protection measures actually work. According to the Wikipedia article on freeze warnings, while temperatures at or near 32 degrees Fahrenheit cause damage to tender plants and sensitive vegetation, it is temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained over a period of time, that kill most types of commercial crops and residential plants. At 28 degrees, the water within plant cells freezes regardless of the plant's natural cold hardening ability. Ice crystals form, expand, and rupture cell membranes. The result at the cellular level is the same as crushing the plant tissue mechanically. And once that cellular damage occurs, there is no recovery. The National Weather Service's Frost and Freeze program defines the growing season as the period between the median date of the last spring freeze and the median date of the first fall freeze. During this period, the NWS issues frost advisories and freeze warnings specifically because vegetation is actively growing and therefore maximally vulnerable to cold damage. The NWS Dodge City, Kansas office explained the mechanism of tonight's freeze precisely, stating that clearing skies overnight, combined with an unseasonably cool dome of high pressure crossing the region, will create favorable conditions for temperatures to fall back into the mid-20s to mid-30s. That atmospheric explanation, clear skies, calm winds, high pressure, describes what meteorologists call a radiative freeze. During a radiative freeze, the ground and vegetation surfaces radiate heat upward into the clear night sky with nothing to block or reflect that heat back. The result is that surface temperatures drop far more rapidly than the official air temperature measured at standard height. AccuWeather's senior meteorologist Brett Anderson explained this phenomenon precisely. Frost forms based on the temperature of surfaces, not the official air temperature in a forecast. Air temperature is typically measured about 5 to 6 feet above the ground, but on clear, calm nights, surfaces like grass, car roofs, or rooftops can cool much faster. This means that even in areas where the forecast low temperature is listed as 33 or 34 degrees, technically above freezing, frost can still form on exposed plant surfaces, car windows, and roads. The official forecast number understates the actual risk to exposed surfaces, which is why the NWS issues frost advisories even when temperatures are not technically forecast to drop to 32 degrees. The Old Farmer's Almanac notes that frost dates are averages based on historical climate data using a 30% probability threshold, meaning there is still a chance of frost after the listed last frost date. The Almanac explicitly warns, always check your local forecast before planting warm season crops outdoors. In May, most of the Midwest and Northeast are statistically past that date, meaning most gardeners and farmers have already planted under the assumption that frost danger has passed. This week's freeze is striking communities that have already made planting decisions, bought seedlings, installed irrigation systems for new crops, and committed to a growing season that is now being threatened by conditions that statistically should not be occurring. Let me walk through the specific regions facing the greatest danger from tonight's freeze and the frost events continuing through this week. Western and southern Wisconsin is the absolute bullseye for the coldest temperatures, with the NWS La Crosse freeze warning calling for lows of 23 degrees Fahrenheit. This region is home to significant dairy farming, cranberry production. Wisconsin produces more than half of the nation's cranberries, and apple orchards currently in the vulnerable blossom stage. A 23-degree freeze in mid-May is not just damaging to orchards in blossom, it is catastrophic. Michigan, bordering Wisconsin to the east, faces similarly dangerous overnight temperatures. Michigan's agricultural identity is deeply tied to cherry and apple production. The state produces more tart cherries than any other state in the nation, and those cherry orchards in northern Michigan are currently in the vulnerable period between blossom and early fruit development. A hard freeze at this stage does not just kill the current year's crop. It can kill the bud tissue that will produce next year's blossoms as well, meaning a single frost event creates 2 consecutive years of production losses. Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky are all under freeze warnings. These 3 states sit at the heart of the eastern corn belt, and while corn itself is relatively frost tolerant before it emerges from the soil, any corn that has already emerged, and significant portions have, given the warm March that accelerated planting timelines, is extremely vulnerable to the sub-freezing temperatures expected tonight. Corn seedlings killed by frost mean replanting, which means late-season corn that is at higher risk from fall frost on the back end of the growing season. Pennsylvania and New York are carrying freeze warnings for multiple counties, with sub-freezing temperatures in the upper 20s expected in rural valleys where cold air pools most intensely on clear, calm nights. The grape-growing regions of upstate New York, including the Finger Lakes wine country, are in a particularly vulnerable position. Grapevines that have broken dormancy and begun putting out new growth are among the most frost-sensitive agricultural plants in existence. New growth on grapevines can be killed at temperatures just a few degrees below freezing, and damage to the vine canopy in May can reduce yields for the entire growing season. New England, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine is facing frost advisories across most interior areas. The maple sugaring season is long over, but orchard crops and berry production in this region are highly vulnerable. Vermont's apple orchards, Connecticut's specialty vegetable farms, and Maine's wild blueberry fields, one of Maine's most economically significant agricultural products, are all at risk from tonight's freeze. The window to protect vulnerable plants and property is right now, not tomorrow morning. Here is exactly what you need to do if you are in one of the affected areas. For home gardeners, the most important action is covering tender plants immediately. Any warm season vegetable, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, beans, that is already in the ground needs to be covered tonight. Use old bed sheets, burlap, frost cloth, or floating row covers. Do not use plastic sheeting directly on plants, as plastic traps cold air against the foliage and accelerates frost damage rather than preventing it. The covering needs to extend all the way to the ground to trap the residual warmth from the soil. Remove coverings in the morning once temperatures rise back above 35 degrees. For potted plants, bring them indoors or into a garage tonight without exception. For outdoor plumbing, disconnect and drain garden hoses. If you have outdoor faucets without frost-free shutoffs, consider wrapping them with insulating foam covers available at any hardware store. The NWS has specifically warned that tonight's freeze could damage unprotected outdoor plumbing, and a burst pipe from a single freeze event can cause thousands of dollars in water damage. For farmers and agricultural producers in the affected regions, the options depend heavily on the specific crop and the available resources. Wind machines and overhead irrigation are the most effective tools for frost protection in established orchards and vineyards. When water freezes on plant tissue, it releases latent heat that keeps the tissue temperature right at 32 degrees, above the damaging threshold, as long as irrigation continues. This is counterintuitive but well-established agricultural science. Wet plants survive frost better than dry ones when irrigation is continuous. Row covers and low tunnels provide meaningful protection for vegetable crops. Smudge pots and heating systems can protect small, high-value plots. But for large-scale exposed crops, tonight's 23-degree low in Wisconsin is beyond what most passive frost protection can fully mitigate. For anyone in the affected areas with elderly neighbors or family members, please check on them. Extended cold combined with potential heating system issues can create dangerous conditions for elderly people, particularly those in older homes with less efficient heating or those on fixed incomes who may be reluctant to run their heat aggressively. Hypothermia can develop indoors at temperatures that most healthy adults would consider merely uncomfortable. The symptoms, confusion, slurred speech, drowsiness, slow and shallow breathing, can be mistaken for normal aging or medication effects. If you see these symptoms in an elderly person in cold conditions, treat it as a medical emergency and call 911. AccuWeather's Brett Anderson noted that after this weekend, most nights should not bring frost or freeze conditions in the Midwest and Northeast, but a couple of nights could still see them, especially in the Midwest, away from the Great Lakes. That is important context. Tonight and the next few nights represent the peak danger window, but the pattern does not completely clear immediately. Gardeners and farmers need to remain alert through the middle of next week before the risk substantially diminishes. What makes this frost event so significant in the broader context of 2026 is that it is occurring simultaneously with all of the other extreme weather unfolding across the country. The same cold air mass that is bringing 23-degree temperatures to Wisconsin tonight is also the cold air that has been fueling the persistent severe weather pattern across the southern plains. The contrast between that cold air mass and the tropical Gulf moisture streaming northward is what has been generating tornadoes, hail, and flooding from Texas to Alabama all week. In Wisconsin, you have the cold side of that contrast producing a killing frost. In Arkansas, you have the warm side of that same contrast producing violent thunderstorms and tornadoes. This is a single atmospheric system producing completely opposite impacts 700 miles apart. AccuWeather's summer 2026 forecast warned that El Niño is expected to develop early in the summer and will have a growing influence on the weather pattern across the United States through the rest of 2026, potentially evolving into a rare super El Niño later in the year, with even bigger impacts on weather across the United States in the final months of 2026 and the start of 2027. The polar vortex disruption that created this spring's persistent cold in the Midwest and Northeast is itself a symptom of the broader large-scale atmospheric instability that is setting the stage for a volatile summer ahead. The cold is not a sign that summer will be mild. Historical analogs suggest precisely the opposite. Springs with persistent polar vortex disruptions are frequently followed by volatile, extreme summers with sharp temperature swings and active severe weather patterns. USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey confirmed the broader agricultural outlook, noting that a ridge of high pressure is expected to persist over the western United States through the summer, potentially intensifying drought conditions in that region, while the Midwest may see more moderate temperatures, but continued weather volatility. For American agriculture, 2026 is shaping up as one of the most challenging years in recent memory. Too cold in the Midwest during planting season, too hot and dry in the West, too wet and flooded across the South, and too volatile everywhere in between. If this video reached you before tonight's freeze, you still have time to protect what matters. Cover your plants, bring in your potted flowers, disconnect your hoses, check on your elderly neighbors. And share this video right now with everyone you know who gardens, farms, or lives in the 18-state frost zone, because the window to act is closing fast and most people have no idea what temperatures are coming tonight. Hit subscribe on Weather Signal and turn on your notifications. This frost event is not the last cold story of the spring, and the pattern building for next week brings a completely different set of severe weather risks that you're going to want to know about before they arrive. Every major weather development this season, we cover it here with the latest data, the clearest explanations, and the specific action items that could protect your property, your crops, and your family. Hit that like button so this forecast reaches more people in the frost zone who still have time to prepare. Stay with Weather Signal, and stay warm out there tonight.